I always thought the word family meant something unbreakable, a circle you could never be pushed out of no matter how many times you stumbled or how different you felt. But as I stood in the marble foyer of the Grand Oak Bistro, clutching my purse and smoothing the wrinkles from my dress, I realized that sometimes family is just a word people use to draw lines in the sand. Sometimes it's a velvet rope you're not allowed to cross. The restaurant was buzzing with the kind of energy that only comes from special occasions. Waiters in crisp black uniforms glided between tables, balancing trays of champagne flutes and silver-domed platters. The air was thick with the scent of roasted, garlic and truffle oil, and the low hum of conversation was punctuated by bursts of laughter from the private dining room at the back, the room my family had reserved for my father's 60th birthday. I paused at the threshold, my heart thumping in my chest. Through the frosted glass, I could see them, my parents, my older brother, and his wife, my younger sister, and her fiancé, my aunt and uncle, even my cousin who'd flown in from Seattle. They were all gathered around a long, gleaming table, the centerpiece a riot of white lilies and flickering candles. My mother was in the middle of a story, her hands animated, her face lit up. My father, regal in his navy suit, was holding court at the head of the table, his booming laugh echoing through the room. I took a breath, squared my shoulders, and pushed open the door. The room fell quiet for a split second, just long enough for me to feel the weight of every eye turning my way. My mother's smile faltered just a flicker, but it was enough. My brother's wife glanced at her phone. My sister's fiancé offered a tight, polite nod. Only my cousin Mark gave me a genuine smile, but even that felt like a lifeline tossed into a stormy sea. "Hi, everyone," I said, forcing brightness into my voice. "Sorry I'm a little late. Traffic was." My mother cut me off with a wave of her hand. "We were just about to order," she said, her tone brisk. "You can sit there." She gestured to a small table set off to the side near the window. It was round, meant for two, and conspicuously separate from the main table. A single place setting gleamed in the candlelight. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her right. "Oh, I thought the big table is for family," my father said, not unkindly, but with a finality that left no room for argument. "We needed the space for everyone. You understand." I looked at the table. There were empty seats. At least 3. But I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Of course, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "No problem." I made my way to the little table, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor. The waiter appeared all practiced smiles and professional detachment. "Can I get you something to drink?" he asked, as if he hadn't just witnessed my public exile. "Just water, please," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. From my vantage point, I could see everything. The way my mother leaned in to whisper something to my sister, who stifled a giggle behind her hand. The way my brother's wife scrolled through her phone, barely glancing up as the waiter poured her wine. The way my father raised his glass in a toast, his words lost in the clatter of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation. I tried to focus on the menu, but the words blurred together. Duck confit, wild mushroom risotto, seared scallops. All of it sounded delicious, but my appetite had vanished. I glanced at the clock on my phone. It was only 7:15. The night stretched ahead, endless and heavy. The waiter returned with my water and a polite smile. "Are you ready to order?" I hesitated. "I'll just have the house salad, please." He nodded, jotting it down. "Would you like to add chicken or salmon?" "No, thank you. Just the salad." He disappeared, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I tried to listen in on the conversation at the main table, but their laughter felt like it was coming from another world. Every so often, someone would glance my way, then quickly look back at their plate. I wondered if they felt guilty, or if this was just another family tradition I'd somehow missed the memo on. I thought about leaving, just standing up, grabbing my purse, and walking out into the night. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the stubborn belief that if I just stayed, if I just endured, things would change. The salad arrived, a delicate arrangement of greens and edible flowers drizzled with a vinaigrette that tasted faintly of citrus and regret. I picked at it, forcing myself to eat, to act normal, to pretend that I wasn't sitting alone at a table meant for two while my family celebrated. Without me just a few feet away, as the night wore on, the noise from the main table grew louder. More wine was poured. More stories were told. More toasts were made. I watched as my father opened his gifts, each one met with applause and laughter. I watched as my mother dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin, overcome with emotion. I watched as my brother and sister posed for photos, their arms around each other, their smiles wide and genuine. No one invited me to join. No one called me over for a picture. No one asked if I wanted dessert. I checked my phone again. 8:30, I could leave now, I told myself. No one would notice. No one would care. But just as I was about to stand, the waiter appeared at my side, a folded piece of paper in his hand. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice low. "The bill." I stared at it, confused. "The bill?" But he nodded toward the main table. "Your family said you'd be taking care of it. The total comes to $200. For a moment, I just stared at the bill, the numbers swimming in front of my eyes. $2,200. My mind tried to make sense of it, to find some mistake, some explanation. I looked up at the waiter, searching his face for a hint of a joke, a wink, anything to suggest this was some elaborate misunderstanding. But his expression was neutral, professional, as if he'd delivered news like this 100 times before. I glanced over at the main table. My family was deep in conversation, my father gesturing animatedly as he recounted some story from his college days. My mother was laughing, her hand resting lightly on his arm. My brother and sister were clinking glasses, their faces flushed with wine and celebration. Not one of them looked my way. Not one of them acknowledged the waiter standing at my side, the bill in his hand. I felt a flush creeping up my neck, a hot prickling embarrassment that made my skin itch. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, to become invisible, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped between the reality of the bill in my hand and the unreality of the scene unfolding just a few feet away. I think there's been a mistake, I managed my voice barely above a whisper. I only ordered a salad. I didn't. The waiter shook his head, his tone gentle but firm. Your family said you'd be covering the entire table. They asked me to bring the bill to you. I looked down at the bill again, my hands trembling. The list of charges was endless. Appetizers, entrees, bottles of wine, desserts, even a round of after-dinner drinks. Every item was accounted for, every indulgence tallied up and handed to me like a final exam I hadn't studied for. I tried to catch my mother's eye, but she was busy pouring herself another glass of wine. My father was telling a joke, his laughter booming across the room. My brother was scrolling through photos on his phone, showing them to his wife, who giggled and leaned in closer. My sister was dabbing at her lipstick, her reflection caught in the polished silver of her spoon. I felt a wave of anger rising in my chest, hot and sharp. How could they do this to me? How could they sit there celebrating while I was left to foot the bill for a dinner I hadn't even been invited to share? I wanted to stand up, to shout, to demand an explanation, but the words caught in my throat, strangled by years of swallowing my pride, of keeping the peace, of telling myself that things would get better if I just tried a little harder. I took a shaky breath and reached for my purse. My hands fumbled with the zipper, searching for my wallet. I knew I didn't have enough to cover the bill. My credit card was already close to its limit, my checking account barely enough to get me through the month. I thought about the rent that was due in a week, the car payment, the groceries I still needed to buy. The numbers spun in my head, a dizzying carousel of anxiety and dread. The waiter stood patiently, his eyes kind but distant. I wondered how many times he'd seen scenes like this, how many families had left one of their own to pick up the pieces. I wondered if he pitied me, or if I was just another story he'd tell his coworkers at the end of the night. I glanced at the bill again, my vision blurring with unshed tears. I could feel the eyes of the other diners on me, their curiosity sharp and unkind. I imagined what they saw, a woman alone at a table, abandoned by her family, left to pay for a celebration she hadn't been allowed to join. I closed my eyes, willing myself not to cry. Not here, not now. When I opened them, the waiter was still there waiting. I forced myself to speak, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. Can you split the bill? I asked, my words careful, measured. I only had the salad. The rest should go to the main table. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the group. I'm sorry, miss. Your family was very clear. The entire bill is to be paid by you. I felt something inside me snap, a thin thread stretched too tight for too long. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The sound was loud, jarring, and for the first time all night, the conversation at the main table faltered. My mother looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. My father's smile faded, replaced by a look of mild annoyance. I walked over to the table, the bill clutched in my hand. Every step felt like a battle. Every breath a declaration of war. Excuse me? I said, my voice louder than I intended. There seems to be some confusion. The waiter just brought me the bill for the entire dinner. $2,200. I only had a salad. My mother blinked, her lips pursed in a tight line. We thought you wouldn't mind. she said, her tone dismissive. You know how expensive these things can be. You're always so responsible. My father nodded as if that settled the matter. It's your turn, isn't it? We all take turns. I stared at them, disbelief warring with anger. I wasn't even invited to sit at the table, I said, my voice shaking. You made it very clear that I wasn't part of the celebration. My brother shrugged, not meeting my eyes. It's just money. You'll figure it out. I looked around the table, searching for a hint of remorse, a flicker of guilt. But all I saw was indifference, entitlement, a wall I'd never be able to climb. For a moment, the room was silent except for the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. I could feel the eyes of strangers on my back, the weight of their curiosity pressing down on me. My hands were still trembling, the bill crumpled slightly in my grip. I wanted to scream, to throw the paper down and walk out to leave them with the mess they'd made. But I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest. My mother was the first to break the silence. She sighed as if I were a child making a scene in a grocery store. Don't be dramatic, Emily. It's just one dinner. We all make sacrifices for family. I almost laughed at the idea that this was a sacrifice, that I was being asked to do something noble or generous. But there was nothing noble about being excluded. Nothing generous about being used. I looked at my father, hoping for some sign of understanding, but he just shook his head. His jaw set in that stubborn way I remembered from my childhood. You're not a child anymore, he said, his voice low. It's time you started acting like part of the family. I wanted to ask him what that meant. Was being part of the family something I had to pay for? Was it a privilege I had to buy one expensive dinner at a time? I thought about all the times I'd been left out, all the birthdays and holidays where my presence felt like an afterthought. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to earn my place, to prove that I belonged. My sister, always the peacemaker, reached across the table and touched my hand. Come on, Em. Don't make this a big deal. We're all here together. That's what matters. I pulled my hand away, the gesture burning like a brand. No, that's not what matters. What matters is that you all sat here and watched me eat alone. What matters is that you decided I was good enough to pay for your dinner, but not good enough to sit at your table. My brother rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath. His wife looked away, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on the tablecloth. My cousin Mark, the only one who'd smiled at me when I arrived, looked uncomfortable, his gaze flickering between me and the rest of the family. I felt the anger rising again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the hot, wild anger of humiliation. It was cold, clear, a kind of certainty I'd never felt before. I realized in that moment that I was done. Done trying to fit in, done trying to please people who would never see me, never value me for who I was. I straightened my shoulders and looked the waiter in the eye. I'm not paying this bill, I said, my voice steady. I'll pay for my salad and that's it. The waiter hesitated, glancing at my family, then back at me. I'll need to speak to the manager, he said quietly. Please do, I replied, my tone calm. As he walked away, my mother leaned in her voice, a harsh whisper. You're embarrassing us. Is that what you want? To make a scene in front of everyone? I met her gaze, unflinching. No, Mom. I just want to be treated with respect. I want to be treated like family. She scoffed, shaking her head. You always have to make everything about you. I almost laughed again, the absurdity of it all washing over me. For years I'd tried to make myself small, to take up as little space as possible to avoid being a burden. And now, when I finally stood up for myself, I was accused of being selfish. The manager arrived, a tall man with kind eyes and a practiced smile. Is there a problem here? He asked, his voice gentle. I handed him the bill. There's been a misunderstanding. I was seated separately from my family and I only ordered a salad. They told the waiter I'd be paying for the entire table, but I never agreed to that. He glanced at my family, then back at me. I see. Let me check with your server and see what we can do. As he walked away, my father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. You always have to make things difficult, don't you? I shook my head, a sad smile tugging at my lips. No, Dad. I just can't do this anymore. My cousin Mark cleared his throat, finally speaking up. She's right, you know. This isn't fair. My mother shot him a look, but he didn't back down. You all saw her sitting alone. You all knew what was happening. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, uncomfortable, but I felt lighter than I had in years. I realized that I didn't need their approval, their acceptance. I didn't need to buy my way into their good graces. The manager returned the waiter at his side. "We've adjusted the bill," he said, handing me a new slip of paper. "You're only responsible for your salad and your water. The rest will be handled by the main table." Relief flooded through me so intense it made me dizzy. I thanked him, my voice thick with emotion. I paid for my meal, left a generous tip, and stood up. I looked at my family one last time, their faces a mix of anger, embarrassment, and something else, something like shame. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't owe them that. As I walked out of the restaurant, the night air was cool against my skin. I felt free, unburdened, as if I'd finally stepped out of a shadow I hadn't even realized I was living in. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement as I stepped. Outside, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses fading behind me. I paused on the sidewalk, letting the cool air fill my lungs, grounding myself in the present. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to catch up, to apologize, to fix something I hadn't broken. I was just standing there alone, but not lonely, feeling the strange, exhilarating weight of my own choices. I walked slowly toward my car, my heels clicking in a steady rhythm. Each step felt like a small act of rebellion, a quiet declaration that I was done playing the role they'd written for me. I thought about calling a friend, someone who would understand, who would listen without judgment. But I realized I didn't need to explain myself, not tonight. Tonight I was enough. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed in my purse. I hesitated before pulling it out, half expecting a barrage of messages from my mother, each one more pointed than the last. But the screen was blank, save for a single text from Mark: "Proud of you. Call me if you need anything." I smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile, and typed back a simple, "Thank you." I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. The events of the evening replayed in my mind, each detail sharper than the last. The way my mother's voice had gone cold, the way my father had looked through me, the way my siblings had turned away. But instead of pain, I felt a growing sense of clarity. I saw the patterns for what they were, not accidents, not misunderstandings, but choices. Choices they'd made over and over to keep me on the outside. I started the engine and pulled out onto the street, the city unfolding before me in a blur of neon and shadow. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare me. I was free to choose my own direction, to write my own story. As I drove, my mind wandered back to childhood, to the early signs I'd ignored or explained away. The birthday parties where my gifts were opened last, if at all. The family vacations where I was always assigned the cot in the corner, the seat by the bathroom, the leftover slice of cake. The way my achievements were met with polite applause, quickly overshadowed by my siblings' louder, brighter successes. I remembered the first time I realized I was different. I was 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, coloring quietly, while my mother and sister baked cookies. My sister spilled flour on the floor and my mother laughed, brushing it away with a wave of her hand. When I accidentally knocked over my glass of milk, the laughter stopped. My mother's face hardened, her voice sharp as she scolded me for being careless. I apologized, but the damage was done. The rest of the afternoon, I watched from the sidelines, invisible. That feeling had followed me into adulthood, a shadow I couldn't shake. I'd spent years trying to earn my place, to prove that I was worthy of love and belonging. I'd bent over backward to accommodate their needs, to smooth over their conflicts, to be the reliable one, the responsible one, the one who never made waves. But tonight, something had shifted. I saw the truth, stark and undeniable. I could never be enough for people who refused to see me. I could never fill a role that was never meant for me. The realization was both heartbreaking and liberating. I grieved for the family I'd always wanted, the one I'd imagined in my loneliest moments. But I also felt a surge of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could build something better for myself. I pulled into the parking lot of a small diner, the kind that stayed open late and served breakfast all day. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a warm glow on the empty booths inside. I slipped into a corner seat, ordered a cup of coffee, and let the quiet wash over me. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about what came next. I knew there would be fallout, angry texts, cold shoulders, whispered conversations behind my back. My mother would call, her voice tight with disappointment. My father would send a terse email, reminding me of my responsibilities. My siblings would close ranks, their loyalty to each other stronger than any bond they'd ever offered me. But I also knew I was done playing by their rules. I was done paying for their approval, done sacrificing my own happiness for the illusion of family. I was ready to set boundaries, to protect my own heart, to choose myself for once. The waitress refilled my coffee, her smile kind and unassuming. "Rough night?" she asked, her tone gentle. I nodded, a wry smile tugging at my lips. "You could say that." She slid a slice of pie across the table. "On the house. Sometimes you just need something sweet." I thanked her, the simple gesture warming me in a way my family's approval never had. I took a bite, savoring the tartness of the apples, the flakiness of the crust. It tasted like comfort, like possibility, like a new beginning. As I sat there watching the world go by outside the window, I realized that family isn't always the people you're born to. Sometimes it's the people who show up when you need them, who see you for who you are, who offer kindness without strings attached. I finished my pie, paid my bill, and stepped back out into the night. The air was crisp, the stars bright overhead. I felt lighter, stronger, more myself than I had in years. The drive home was quiet, the city's noise fading into the background as I turned onto familiar streets. My apartment building stood in the soft glow of the streetlights, a small oasis of calm in the restless city. I parked and sat for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, letting the silence settle around me. I thought about the word home, how it had always felt like a place I was supposed to return to, but tonight it felt like something I was finally claiming for myself, inside. The apartment was just as I'd left it, a stack of books on the coffee table, a half-finished puzzle on the kitchen counter, the faint scent of lavender from the candle I'd lit that morning. I slipped off my shoes and padded into the living room, the soft rug cushioning my steps. I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease, the tightness in my chest, loosening with every breath. I set my purse down and checked my phone. As expected, there were messages, my mother's name at the top, followed by my father, my sister, and even my brother's wife. The notifications glared at me, each one a tiny demand for attention, for explanation, for apology. I didn't open them, not yet. Tonight I needed space. Tonight I needed to remember what it felt like to be enough for myself. I poured a glass of water and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me, the countless times I'd bitten my tongue, swallowed my pride, and told myself that things would get better if I just tried a little harder. I thought about the little girl. I used to be the one who wanted nothing more than to be seen, to be chosen, to be loved. I closed my eyes and pictured her sitting alone at the kitchen table, coloring quietly while the world spun on without her. I wanted to reach back through time, to wrap her in a hug, to tell her that she was enough, just as she was, that she didn't have to earn her place, that she didn't have to pay for love with silence and sacrifice. A tear slipped down my cheek, but I didn't brush it away. I let myself feel the sadness, the grief for what could have been the ache of old wounds finally exposed to the light. I let myself mourn the family I'd always wanted, the one I'd tried so hard to create from the scraps they offered me. But as the tears dried, I felt something else, a quiet strength, a sense of resolve. I realized that I didn't have to keep chasing after people who would never see me, never value me. I could choose myself. I could build a life that felt like home, even if it didn't look the way I'd always imagined. I stood and walked to the bathroom, splashing cool water on my face. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, searching for the girl I used to be. She was there beneath the tired eyes and the lines etched by years of trying too hard. She was there waiting for me to choose her. I smiled a small tentative smile and whispered, "You're enough." The words felt strange at first, but as I repeated them, they began to settle into my bones, to take root in the places that had always felt empty. Changed into pajamas and curled up on the couch, pulling a blanket around my shoulders. I opened my laptop and started a new document, the cursor blinking expectantly. I began to write, not for anyone else, not for approval or validation, but for myself. I wrote about the dinner, about the bill, about the moment I realized I was done trying to buy my way into a family that would never let me in. I wrote about the pie at the diner, the kindness of strangers, the freedom of walking away. The words flowed easily, each sentence a small act of healing. I wrote until my eyes grew heavy, until the city outside my window was quiet and still. I saved the document and closed the laptop, feeling lighter than I had in years. Before I went to bed, I checked my phone one last time. The messages were still there, waiting. I opened the one from Mark. "You did the right thing. If you want to talk, I'm here." I smiled and typed back, "Thank you. I think I'm finally ready to start living for myself." I turned off the lights and slipped into bed, the sheets cool against my skin. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of peace, a sense of possibility. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. I was free. Morning sunlight crept through the blinds, painting golden stripes across my bedroom wall. I woke slowly, the memory of last night settling over me like a soft blanket. There was no panic, no regret, just a quiet certainty that I'd done what I needed to do. I stretched, feeling the gentle ache in my muscles, the kind that comes from carrying a heavy weight for too long and finally setting it down. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the city come alive. People hurried down the sidewalk, bundled against the early chill, their faces set with purpose. I wondered how many of them were carrying burdens like mine, invisible but heavy, shaped by the expectations of others. I wondered how many had ever dared to put themselves first. My phone buzzed again, a fresh wave of notifications lighting up the screen. I scrolled through them, reading each message with a new kind of detachment. My mother's words were sharp, laced with disappointment. "I can't believe you embarrassed us like that. Your father is furious. You need to apologize." My father's message was shorter, colder. "You've made your point. Don't expect us to forget this." My sister's was a mix of confusion and guilt. "I don't know why you had to make a scene. We just wanted to celebrate Dad's birthday. Can't you let things go?" Even my brother's wife chimed in, her tone clipped. "You really ruined the night for everyone." I read them all, then set the phone aside. I didn't feel the old urge to explain myself, to smooth things over, to beg for forgiveness. Instead, I felt a strange sense of relief. Their words no longer had the power to wound me. I saw them for what they were, attempts to pull me back into a role I'd finally outgrown. I spent the morning cleaning my apartment, letting the simple, repetitive motions clear my mind. I opened the windows, letting in the crisp autumn air, and played music that made me feel alive. I rearranged the books on my shelves, sorted through old papers, and donated a bag of clothes I no longer needed. With every task, I felt a little lighter, a little more in control. Around noon, I called Mark. He answered on the first ring, his voice warm and steady. "Hey, Em, how are you holding up?" I smiled, grateful for his kindness. "Better than I expected. Thank you for standing up for me last night." He hesitated, then said I should have done it sooner. "I've seen the way they treat you. It's not right." We talked for a while, sharing stories and laughter, the conversation easy and unforced. Mark told me about his life in Seattle, about the friends he'd made, the family he'd chosen for himself. "You know," he said, "sometimes you have to walk away from the people who hurt you, even if they're family, especially if they're family." His words echoed in my mind long after we hung up. I realized that I wasn't alone, that there were others who understood, who had walked the same path. I thought about the people in my life who had shown me kindness, who had seen me for who I was not, who they wanted me to be. That afternoon, I went for a walk in the park, the leaves crunching beneath my feet. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue. I watched children playing on the swings, their laughter bright and unburdened. I watched couples strolling hand in hand, friends sharing secrets on park benches. I felt a sense of connection, a sense of belonging, not to a family that had never truly accepted me, but to the world itself. I sat on a bench and pulled out my journal, letting the words flow onto the page. I wrote about the dinner, about the bill, about the moment I chose myself. I wrote about the pain and the freedom, the grief and the hope. I wrote about the future I wanted to build, one where I was the author of my own story. As the sun began to set, I made my way home, feeling a quiet joy settle in my chest. I cooked myself a simple dinner, savoring each bite, grateful for the peace I'd found. I lit a candle and curled up with a book, the soft glow filling the room with warmth. Before bed, I checked my phone one last time. There were more messages, more demands for explanation, more attempts to pull me back. I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked the numbers one by one until the screen was finally silent. I slipped into bed, the sheets cool and inviting. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting go of the last remnants of guilt and fear. I was free, truly free for the first time in my life. The next morning, I woke to a world that felt new, as if the air itself had shifted. There was a stillness in my apartment, a kind of peace I'd never known before. I moved through my morning routine with a sense of purpose, each small act making coffee watering, my plants opening the curtains an affirmation that this life was mine and mine alone. I sat at my kitchen table, Sunlight streaming in and opened my laptop. The document I'd started the night of the dinner was still there waiting for me. I read over what I'd written, the words raw and honest, and felt a surge of pride. I kept writing, letting the story unfold my story in my own voice without apology or shame. I wrote about the years of longing, the ache of exclusion, the slow realization that I could never be enough for people who refused to see me. I wrote about the moment I stood up, the moment I chose myself, the moment I walked away. As I wrote, I felt the old wounds begin to heal, the scars softening with every sentence. I realized that I wasn't just telling my story, I was reclaiming it. I was taking back the narrative, refusing to let anyone else define who I was or what I deserved. Later that day, I met Mark for lunch at a small cafe near the park. He greeted me with a hug, his presence a reminder that family could be chosen, that love didn't have to come with conditions. We talked for hours, sharing memories and dreams, laughter and silence. For the first time, I felt truly seen, truly understood. After lunch, I wandered through the city, letting my feet carry me wherever they wanted to go. I stopped at a bookstore, losing myself in the aisles, the scent of paper and ink soothing my soul. I bought a novel I'd been meaning to read, a story about a woman who finds her strength in the face of adversity. It felt like a sign, a gentle nudge from the universe. That evening, I called an old friend I hadn't spoken to in months. We talked late into the night, our conversation winding through old memories and new beginnings. She listened without judgment, offering support and encouragement, reminding me that I was never truly alone. As the days passed, I began to build a new routine, one that centered on my own needs and desires. I joined a yoga class, started volunteering at a local animal shelter, reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with. I filled my days with things that brought me joy, things that made me feel alive. I also started therapy, determined to break the patterns that had held me captive for so long. My therapist listened patiently as I unraveled the tangled threads of my past, helping me see the ways I'd internalized my family's rejection. She taught me to set boundaries, to honor my own feelings, to trust my instincts. With her guidance, I learned to forgive myself for the years I'd spent trying to earn love that was never freely given. One afternoon, as I walked through the park, I saw a little girl sitting alone on a bench, her knees drawn up to her chest. She reminded me of myself all those years ago, quiet, watchful, hoping to be chosen. I sat beside her, offering a gentle smile. We talked about her favorite books, her dreams for the future, the things that made her happy. As we talked, I realized that I was finally becoming the person I'd always needed, the person who would choose me every time. That night, I wrote a letter to my family. I didn't send it, but I needed to put the words on paper to release them from my heart. I thanked them for the lessons they'd taught me, even the painful ones. I forgave them for the ways they'd hurt me, not because they deserved it, but because I deserved peace. I promised myself that I would never again shrink to fit someone else's expectations, that I would never again pay for love with my silence. I ended the letter with a simple truth: I am enough. As I sealed the letter and tucked it away, I felt a sense of closure, a sense of freedom. I knew there would be hard days ahead, moments when the old wounds would ache, when the loneliness would creep in. But I also knew that I was strong enough to face them, that I had built a life worth living, a life that belonged to me. I turned off the lights and stood by the window, looking out at the city below. The world was vast and uncertain, but it was also full of possibility. I was no longer waiting for an invitation to the table. I was building my own. And as I stood there, bathed in the soft glow of the city lights, I whispered a promise to myself, a promise to keep choosing me every single day,